Plugin of the week comes from Tone Projects. Michelangelo is the name of the plugin. This is from Hendy Amps. It's a boutique EQ saturation unit built by Chris Henderson. This is essentially, it's a pretty simple device you could use for mastering, you could use for individual sounds on the surface. And what Tone Projects did to the emulation of this actual hardware unit really explodes the possibilities. Now, it's actually much more complicated, or there's a lot more to it than just meets the eye, because you look at it and you see 6 knobs. One of them's, basically aggression. The other is trim for the output, and you have 4 EQs. Seems like it's pretty straightforward with a couple of EQ selections, but there's a lot of band interaction. There's a lot going on with the saturation and the way that works. And you can get a lot of unique tones out of it once you really, really dig into it. So let's just kind of do a quick overview, and then I'll start to dial it in and kind of unpack it, because there's a whole other section which really explodes the possibilities, but I'll kind of get into that step by step. So if we start just up in the top, undo, redo, AB, all of that sort of stuff. EQ scale is kind of cool. So as you do EQ plus minus, you can exaggerate that, right, up to 200 or to 200 in the negative direction. So what that allows you to do is invert the boosts into attenuations, right? So sometimes it's a good way to kind of hear something that's going on. Different quality standards. So from low latency up to pristine. When you render, you can render it out at pristine. This is an on-off that'll basically act as a bypass. You see it activates the bypass here in Pro Tools. And the rest is really EQ, a saturation control, right? So this is the aggressive or aggression control is basically driving into the tube amps, right? So you're getting a bit of tube saturation here, which you can then control. We have different boost and attenuation. So it's weird because 5, which is in the middle, is no boost or attenuation. So normally that would be like a 0, and then you go plus minus. That's not the way this is set up here. So if I go left, that's negative. If I go to the right, that's positive in terms of gain structure. Low, mid, high, and an air band. Then there's an output trim that's over here. One of the most useful features, and before I get into all of this, is the auto gain. The auto gain I'm going to turn on, so as I make adjustments, it'll automatically compensate the output gain so that I preserve something close to unity gain. There's also a match feature which requires that you play the audio through, which will give you a more accurate gain match, but for the purposes of the demonstration, this will probably work perfectly well. Let's see. So with the low band, we have 2 selections, 80 hertz and 150. Now they have a different shapes. I think the 80 hertz is a bit more resonant, has a mid-range dip. In the mid, you have a flat and a full. And if I remember correctly, one of them gives you more mid-range, which I think is the flat, and then the full extends the mid-range down into the low-mid frequencies and almost into the low frequencies. Similar type of thing with the high boost. There's smooth and sharp. The smooth will give you a high-frequency boost. The sharp will extend it down a little bit more into the upper mid frequencies. Air shift, similar type of thing. There's an on-off here, so it's normally like an air frequency boost. It'll give you a boost with the air shift on, like around 10K or so is where you'll start to really get that boost or feel that boost. It's pretty subtle. And then with the off, it shifts it down to a lower frequency. So what you're getting is some simple selections. They're pretty broad EQs. These are bell curves in the middle, basically shelving on the low end, shelving on the high end, or air frequency rather. And then you have an output trim. All pretty straightforward. So let's just get a little bit of a sound here. There's also a calibration here, so you can drive this tube saturation a bit more. But let's just start with this, and then we'll unpack some of the additional possibilities. Here we go.
What's the deal with your actions? I can't buy what you're selling me.
So So you'll see as you kind of drive it, you get a bit more grit, and then the high frequency starts to drop a little bit. And there you can obviously compensate for that with the boost or attenuation. But it just gives you a little bit of an extra edge on there. I'm going to take the vocal out for right now. All right, so let's see. And then with the calibration here, it's at the normal setting. I can drive it more or make it cleaner. So all of these settings exist on the hardware unit. So that just to add a little bit of body, a little bit of depth into it, right? And we'll dig into that a little bit more. Now we got the boosts here. So I'm just going to go with an 80 hertz boost. I'll just kind of dive through here and then show you some of the differences with some of these. So flat gives you the fuller low-mid frequency boost. You could hear that kick in. Right, so you can hear just like the depth and focus that it really creates with everything. You know, it's really powerful just with some simple settings. All right, so on the basic part of it, it's just as simple as that, working with it. Now, as you drive different things more or less, you'll get different characteristics of saturation with the different sections, but we could sort of explode it by opening up the panel here, and this is where you really get into more possibilities. So this is a separate section, a tube compression section. That's what they call it, although really it's basically when you drive transients into tubes, the way that the tubes interact with that is more or less what this is doing. So this can sort of soften the transients a bit or leave them a bit more natural sounding. And obviously a lot of places in between. There's also the original hardware unit is based on a triode 12AX7, but you can drive it to a pentode tube, right? So this will drive warmer harmonics. This will drive brighter harmonics, more third order or odd harmonics, rather. Excuse me. So we could blend a little bit of that in to get a little bit of air. There's also a couple of features here. Spread. What this does is it kind of differentiates the left and right from each other. So it's not a spread like a normal width processing. What it's kind of doing is creating a bit of variation between the left and the right side. It's pretty subtle, may not come across. And crosstalk, there's also a bit of crosstalk built in, somewhat similar to what happens with an analog tape where you get a little bit of bleed from one side into the other, creates a more solid mono structure. So there's a little bit of that. We could go into the weeds with this. This is a pretty subtle. I'll leave that sort of for the mastering thing, but just so you understand what that is. And there's also a reverse there for like when it differentiates, you can make it go the other way. Left becomes right and right becomes left. The variation, not the settings. Okay. All right. So we got that. Now, where this really explodes is here, because now we could take any of the individual bands here, right? And we can now have separate drive for each of those. So we can, take this and clean up the low end or drive the low end more, or any of the particular areas. So if we want a cleaner, crisper air, for example, we could pull the drive down. Right? Or leave it just where it is. Okay. And you'll see some indications from like a blue LED that'll light up. That'll be a light amount of saturation or drive. And if it turns red, then you're into pretty heavy stuff. All right. So you could do that band by band. There's also a really cool thing here where you can shift the balance of the EQ toward the mid or toward the side. So for example, if I have this low frequency boost, I could shift this just to the middle. So that gives you the ability to really shift where, and by percentage there, how much of it is going to the mid channel versus the side channel, and what percentage or balance of both. On top of that, you also have the ability to shift the EQ more towards the transient side or towards the RMS or body side. So in other words, here, if I want the low end, if I want to clean up a bit of the low end, I can move it, shift it toward the transient. So now I can really focus exactly where this is occurring. And this is great. Like if you just have like a muddy bass, you could throw one of these just on the bass and you can focus the low frequency boost, into the transient. So it kind of gives you a bit more, bump, just to draw a little bit of that energy out, while, taking the body and maybe, dipping it back. And then you could also drive more of the body so you get more grit in there so it images more clearly. So you could see how that, adds like a whole other layer on top of everything. And as if that wasn't enough, now you also have on top of this a dynamic EQ. Now the dynamic EQ will work, and if I hold the shift key, there are a bunch of shift different things here. Like in other words, if I use the shift key and I drive this, it'll simultaneously do the trim, right, in the opposite direction. Okay, if I hold the shift, and there are some settings that's just sort of linked together, like thresholds. If I hold the shift, it'll do all of them at once. If I do the range, it'll do all of them at once. Okay, so the range will basically take the boost and either make it dynamically shoot upward, right? So that would be a positive, right, boost, higher percentage. Or if we go to a negative percentage, it will cut. So it basically is like expansion, or we can switch it to compression, right? So we're going one or two ways. Now, if we invert the threshold, okay, which is this little button here, then what happens is instead of it compressing or expanding the signal above threshold, it will expand or compress things that are below threshold. So now if we use the compression, it will take signals that fall below threshold and it will compress them, make them less dynamic, or we can move them upward as like a loudness kind of thing. Right, so if I take, for example, here, like say I just want to drive this track here a little bit, see if I could set this up. I'll just generically quick do this, bring all my thresholds low at once here, and then drive this upward. So let's see, here we go. Here we hit play. Right? Or I could use it like a normal compressor expander and take different sections, like, sometimes you could take something like have the low end kind of pump upward or expand upward, but the mids kind of dip back a little bit and the high end sort of pump upward, and kind of go back and forth and, going to create a bit more movement, sort of a springiness in the mix. Or you could just kind of work it, you got the individual thresholds. You can also control attack and release time. There's some variations with the sensitivity where if it's triggering, say, too many transients and you want it only to trigger on the louder ones, for example, then you can lower this here, so that will decrease the sensitivity for the threshold. And then there's also a duration control for the duration of the transient, like how long does it kind of hold that energy as you're working. Now, you'll see a series of things, like when I hit play here, we also have the attack and release time that we set. There's no notation about what ratio. I don't think it really necessarily works that way. One of the things, even with the EQ scale, and I believe it's true with the dynamic EQ, is that there's a certain amount of boost that's available and attenuation that's available, and it won't go beyond those parameters. So if you sort of push it more aggressively, it will cap out at some point in terms of the amount of boost. You can see there's a little meter here, which is actually showing you what the boost is, right? And you'll see that moving, as well as seeing the signal kind of level come up here, so you could set your threshold accordingly. It's sort of a soft knee threshold, so it will kind of ramp up. You're going to see gain reduction even if the threshold isn't right down below where the blue meter is coming up. And then you'll see the gain reduction expansion occurring up here within the processes of the different bands. So it gets really amazing. Just like with all of that, you can imagine like all of the possibilities. Then you take it, you got a high pass filter and a low pass filter, which can operate as a low shelf, right? Or 6, 12, 18 dBs, your first, second, third order noise filter. There's a resonant filter here. It looks like a resonant shape there at the 18 dB per octave. And also a soft shelf if you want something, some people prefer that over. Now, this is just, it's this, obviously none of this stuff exists on the original unit, so it's giving you extra control for mastering purposes and for anything else that you do. And then 2 additional bands which are just digital. Now these do drive into, I believe they drive into the output tube circuitry, but so you can get some extra, drive in, right? There's gain, frequency control, adjustment for mid-side transient body, and you can make it dynamic just like you can any of the other bands. So those are just 2 additional bands for detailing stuff. You could use it to de-ess, de-harsh, like any of those types of things. If you wanted to do detailing thing like that, notch something out, in from a particular area from the mid channel, for example, and kind of do some detailing work that sort of gives you free range for working with that. The match will just match the gain. So if I play through, this will just give me a better match than the auto gain. This just operates in real time, and it works pretty well just overall. And then there's an input and output control here. If you hold the shift key, they'll actually work in opposition, so you can actually drive the whole unit. This is like a digital input output that drives everything from basically setting your gain staging from the input to the output. There's also some additional settings here in the information setting to show who it's registered to, the user interface size, all of that sort of stuff. The reference, you could set the reference to auto. This is preferable if you want to go through presets. Because what it'll do is it'll automatically set the standards. So if there's a expected certain amount of saturation with the preset, it'll adjust or adapt accordingly so that the input signal will give you the same amount of saturation. So it's like a way of adjusting the input and output levels to get that. Because otherwise, if you're hitting it really hot, you may get more saturation and not get the full effect of the preset. So I thought that was pretty smart. I had it turned off here because I want it to work just exactly as it is. You can get to the manual and all of that. And I think that's pretty much it. This is an unbelievable unit, and the more that you dig into it, the more possibilities that you can hear with it. Just having like a great analog unit, sounding unit like this, emulation on its own, the mid-side control, the transient body control, it's already off the hook for me right there. The dynamics is just like another bonus, the extra bands. It's amazing how far you can go. You close this up, and it all looks pretty simple and straightforward, and it really gets detailed. Tone Projects is unbelievable at this. Every plugin they have is really amazing in exactly the same way. They do incredible work, and I could not recommend this more. You start diving into different plugins or different sounds and stuff like that, and you'll just keep going forever and ever. All right, that's it. Plugin of the week from Tone Projects, Michelangelo. Check it out. At minimum, get a demo. It's worth every penny. You'll love it. So check it out. Plugin of the week.